Her voice was the only thing she had to sell. A 10-year-old blind girl, singing for coins on a frozen city corner, her future measured in the rustle of a few dollars in a tin cup. Then a billionaire stepped out of the crowd and made her an offer that should have changed everything. What she said next wasn't just a refusal. It was the key to a story of exploitation nobody was supposed to hear. Her name was Amara, a 10-year-old with a voice that could stop traffic and a secret that kept her on that corner. To the blurred passersby, she was just another tragic figure in the urban landscape. But her refusal of a billionaire's fortune wasn't an act of pride. It was a calculated survival move. Because Amara wasn't singing for herself. She was performing for a hidden system, and her silence was the only currency she had left to buy her family's safety. What she knew would expose an entire economy built on the suffering of children. Every day followed the same cruel rhythm. Amara would be guided to her spot on the corner of 5th and Market by a man named Leo who called himself her uncle. Her small stool, her tin cup, her worn jacket. The autumn leaves would skitter past her feet and she would sing. Not children's songs, but old blues and soul standards she'd learned from recordings, her voice carrying a weight that didn't belong to a child. Her blindness made her the perfect investment. She couldn't see the pity in people's eyes, couldn't witness the moments of hesitation before a coin was dropped. She could only hear the results. The clink of a quarter was different from the rustle of a dollar bill. Leo had taught her to count by sound. He sat on a nearby bus stop bench, always watching, a silent overseer. At the end of each 6-hour shift, Leo would empty the cup. He'd press the day's earnings into her hand, let her feel the bills and coins, and then take it all back. For safekeeping, he'd say, for your mama's medicine. The amount was always wrong. Amara knew the sound of money too well. If she heard the distinct crinkle of what felt like $40, he'd tell her they made 15. Her mother, Adira, was sick. That part was true. A degenerative condition that required expensive medications not covered by any aid. Amara's singing was supposed to be the answer, but the math never worked. The medicine never appeared, only more promises and a deepening fear that speaking up would make the little they had vanish completely. Then on a Tuesday in late October, the pattern broke. A man's shoes stopped in front of her, not the quick, shuffling steps of a commuter, but a long, solid silence. She finished her song. The man didn't move. Then he spoke. His voice was low, calm, and carried an authority that made Leo shift nervously on his bench. "You have an extraordinary gift, young lady." He asked her name. He asked about the songs, and then he made his offer. "I can help you. Proper training, a real education, a life where you don't have to sit in the cold." He said his name was Elias Thorne. He said he built tech companies. He said he could change everything. Amara felt the weight of the offer. She also felt Leo's stare burning into the side of her face from 20 feet away, a silent warning in the chill air. To accept was to break a contract she never signed. She took a slow breath. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice clear. "But my place is here. My family needs me here." The billionaire, Elias Thorne, was stunned. He pressed gently. He mentioned sums of money that were abstract fairy tales to Amara. She just shook her head, a serene, final gesture. Thorne eventually left, dropping a single $100 bill into her cup, a bill Leo would later swap for a 5. But Thorne was a man who solved puzzles for a living. A refusal that didn't align with obvious self-interest was the most intriguing puzzle of all. He didn't just walk away. He sent an assistant the next day to discreetly observe. And the day after that, what they reported back wasn't a heartwarming tale of familial duty. It was a pattern of control. Leo was always there. The money was always collected. The same tired-looking woman, Adira, came once at midday to bring Amara a lunch bag, always exchanging hurried, tense words with Leo. Thorne's team ran a basic background check. Leo had a record for petty fraud. Adira had no criminal history, but her medical debt was catastrophic. Thorne began to see the shape of the cage. The sickness was real. The poverty was real. But in the gap between those truths, a predator was operating. He realized Amara's beautiful voice wasn't just a talent. It was a commodity in a very small, brutal marketplace. Her blindness didn't just evoke sympathy, it made her easier to control, harder to verify the reality of her own exploitation. He decided to bypass the handlers. One evening, as Amara was being led to a beat-up sedan by Leo, Thorne's car pulled up alongside them. He stepped out. Leo's grip on Amara's arm tightened. Thorne ignored him, speaking directly to Amara. "I know you're afraid," he said. "I know the numbers don't add up. Let me speak to your mother just once. With you there, no one else." Amara, frozen, turned her head slightly toward Leo's direction. A tiny, instinctive check for permission. That single, heartbreaking gesture told Thorne everything he needed to know. This wasn't choice. It was compliance born of fear. Against Leo's snarled protests, Thorne drove Amara home. The apartment was a single room in a building that smelled of damp and despair. Adira, frail and wrapped in a blanket, was terrified to see a stranger, but lit up at the sound of her daughter's voice. Thorne laid it out plainly. He showed Adira, using the notes on his phone, what a voice like Amara's could earn in a legitimate youth choir with proper patronage. He showed her the math of their current situation, the impossible gap between Amara's likely earnings and the medicine's cost. Adira wept. She confessed she was powerless. Leo wasn't family. He was a manager who had approached them at their most desperate. He handled everything. The rent, the medicine negotiations, the donations. They saw only scraps. She believed if they left him, the fragile support structure would collapse and she would die. Thorne made his real offer then, not just to Amara but to Adira, full medical care, a safe apartment, legal protection from Leo, and for Amara the promised training on the condition that any income be held in a trust until she was 18. It was a lifeline thrown into the center of the room. Amara sat quietly holding her mother's hand. Then she asked the question that would haunt Thorne. "If you help us, what happens to the others?" Thorne was silent. "There's a boy who plays violin on the North Bridge," she continued. "His arm is in a cast that never comes off. There's a girl who dances with a little crutch. Leo talks to their uncles, too." In that moment, Thorne's understanding expanded again. This wasn't just one girl. This was a network. Amara was describing a decentralized, low-profile operation using disabled children as profitable front persons, with handlers skimming the majority of the take. The disabilities, real or exaggerated, were part of the business model, maximizing yield from human sympathy. He assured Amara he would look into it. His priority was getting them out. He arranged for Adira to be moved to a private clinic that night for evaluation. He secured a room for them at a secured residence. The plan was in motion. But as he drove away, he noticed a different car sitting down the block from the old apartment. Leo was on the phone, gesturing angrily. The next morning, Amara and Adira were gone from the safe residence. The clinic said Adira had checked out against medical advice, accompanied by a man matching Leo's description. Amara's tin cup and stool were back on the corner of 5th and Market, but a different, older girl sat there, her eyes downcast. Leo was nowhere to be seen. Thorne's offer hadn't been refused. It had been intercepted. The system had sensed a threat and swallowed its assets whole. His investigation into a single act of charity had just torn the lid off a hidden world. And the only witness who could map its contours, a 10-year-old girl who trusted no one, had vanished into thin air. Elias Thorne wasn't a man accustomed to failure. A missing 10-year-old girl, a vanished mother, and a smug handler who had outmaneuvered him. This wasn't a puzzle. It was a declaration of war. He pulled every resource. His security team, his legal department, his network of contacts in city government and social services. The official channels yielded nothing. Missing persons reports filed by a billionaire carried weight, but the system moved with bureaucratic slowness. Amara and Adira had effectively disappeared into the city's shadow economy. Thorne's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. his own building security footage. Before approaching Amara that first day, he'd been waiting for his car. A camera across the street had captured not just his interaction with her, but Leo's. It showed Leo after Thorne left not collecting the money immediately. Instead, he made a phone call. He was reporting. Thorne's digital forensics team isolated the timestamp and through a contact at the phone company, obtained the number Leo called. It was a prepaid, disposable phone, but it had received one other call that day from another prepaid phone, registered to a fake name at a convenience store 12 miles away. That second phone's location data, however, painted a pattern. It pinged towers near 5 different street corners where child performers were known to work, always during shift changes. Thorne had his first tangible thread. This wasn't a lone operator. Leo was a node in something larger. He hired a discreet private investigation firm with experience in human trafficking patterns. Their mandate: find Amara but map the network. Do not intervene, just watch. For 2 weeks they followed Leo. He never went near Amara's old corner again. Instead, he visited 3 other locations: the North Bridge with the violinist boy, a subway entrance with the dancing girl Amara mentioned, and a new spot by the public library where a child recited poetry in a wheelchair. At each location, Leo would speak briefly with a different adult, a man or woman who always seemed to be loitering nearby. Money changed hands, but it was the handlers paying Leo, not the other way around. The investigators' report reframed everything. Leo wasn't a manager, he was a distributor, a middleman who placed children in high-traffic locations and collected a franchise fee from their handlers. He provided a service, vetting pitches, rotating locations to avoid police and media fatigue, and resolving territorial disputes. The children were the product. Their disabilities, verified or enhanced, were the brand, and the public sympathy was the revenue stream. The pivot came when an investigator, posing as a documentary filmmaker, managed a brief conversation with the boy violinist. His cast, he whispered when his aunt was out of earshot, was just for show. His arm was fine, but the aunt said people give more if they think it's an injury. He missed school. He wanted to play soccer. The dancer's limp, the investigators confirmed through observation, would disappear the moment she left her corner. Amara's blindness, however, was devastatingly real. She was the exception that gave the scheme its veneer of legitimacy. A truly disabled child among faked ones, her authentic suffering used to camouflage a wider fraud. This explained Leo's extreme reaction to Thorne's intervention. Amara wasn't just a revenue source, she was camouflage. Losing her risked exposing the entire operation. Then, a financial analyst on Thorne's team made the final chilling connection. He traced shell companies and payment flows from small online charity campaigns. Help heal a child performer, medical fund for a street artist. These campaigns featured photos of the children, including Amara, and pulled at the heartstrings. They were shared widely on social media, generating thousands in donations. The funds were withdrawn to prepaid debit cards controlled by the network. The street performance was just the visible tip of the iceberg. The real money was in digital panhandling, manufactured viral charity. Thorne realized he wasn't fighting one man. He was fighting a distributed, adaptive business model that weaponized empathy. It was a parasite on human kindness, and it was protected by the very shame and fear it instilled in its victims. To go public was to risk the children being moved deeper underground or harmed. To work quietly through back channels had already failed. He needed leverage. He needed someone on the inside. His team identified the weakest link, a handler named Mara, the aunt of the fake violinist boy. She had a record for shoplifting, was drowning in payday loan debt, and had recently been spotted with bruises. The network's discipline was enforced, and she was struggling. Thorne arranged a direct confrontation. No lawyers, no security, just him and Mara in a neutral cafe with the promise of complete immunity and a cash relocation fund if she cooperated. She was terrified, chain-smoking, her eyes darting to the door, but she talked. She confirmed the structure. Leo was a coordinator for a cell of about 8 children in the city's downtown core. There were other cells in other districts, other Leos. The people above Leo, she didn't know. Communication was encrypted. Payments were in cash or crypto. Then she gave him the key. The children were kept in line not just by threats but by a cruel piece of theater. Once a month, all the handlers and children in a cell would be brought together for a family meal. At this meal, a man known only as the benefactor would appear. He was the source of the medicine, the rent money, the promises. He was calm, well-dressed, and spoke of community and sacrifice. He would single out one child for praise and give them a small gift, a new sweater, a toy. And he would quietly remind them in gentle tones what happened to families who broke the trust. He tell a story about another child from another city who had talked to outsiders. That child's parent had their medical support cut off. The family had to move away. The message was clear. Compliance is rewarded, betrayal is met with silent, devastating abandonment. The next family meal was scheduled for 3 days' time at a rented community hall in a nondescript neighborhood. Mara agreed to wear a wire. Thorne now faced an impossible choice. He could bring in the police, raid the gathering, and potentially arrest the low-level handlers and even the benefactor. But the children would be traumatized, treated as evidence, and likely funneled into an overburdened child protection system that might lose them again. Their families, dependent on the network's crumbs, would be destitute. Or he could use the meeting to identify the top of the local chain and gather evidence, but let it continue, leaving the children in place for another month of exploitation. His decision was characteristically ruthless. He chose a third path. He would crash the party himself, not to arrest but to make a new offer, a hostile takeover. The night of the meal, the community hall was brightly lit. Fold-out tables were filled with handlers and quiet, anxious children picking at pizza. Amara was there, sitting close to her mother, who looked paler and more withdrawn than ever. Leo stood near the door, surveying the room. The atmosphere was one of forced cheer undercut by deep tension. Then the benefactor arrived. He wasn't a menacing figure. He was a middle-aged man in a neat sweater vest carrying a briefcase. He moved from table to table, greeting each child by name, asking after their health. He knelt by Amara and told her he'd heard her singing was as beautiful as ever. She just nodded, her face turned down. As he stood to begin his usual speech, the hall's main doors opened again. Elias Thorne walked in alone, every head turned. Leo's face drained of color. The benefactor's smile froze, then melted into confusion. Thorne didn't shout. He simply walked to the front of the room, his presence silencing the space. He looked at the children, then at the handlers, and finally at the man in the sweater vest. "My name is Elias Thorne," he said, his voice carrying. "I've been looking into your operation. I know how it works. The corners, the fake charity pages, the family meals." He paused, letting the panic set in. "I'm not here with the police. Not yet." He turned his gaze directly to the benefactor. "I'm here to make you an offer. You're going to walk out of this room and you're going to dissolve this cell. You're going to release these families from their debts, the medical, the rent, all of it. You will transfer control of the charity pages to an auditor I appoint. In return, I won't hand the evidence I have, including testimony from inside this room, to the district attorney. You'll walk away, not rich but free." The room was deathly quiet. The benefactor's calm facade cracked. "You have no evidence. These people won't talk. They know what happens." "They already have," Thorne said, nodding toward Mara. He then looked at Amara. "Her trust fund is already established. Her mother is scheduled for real treatment at a real hospital tomorrow. The old rules are broken." A standoff hung in the air. The benefactor calculated, his eyes darting to Leo, to the terrified handlers. His entire enterprise was built on the illusion of benevolent control. Thorne had just exposed it as a brittle facade. With a final, venomous look, the benefactor picked up his briefcase and walked out. Leo, after a moment of stunned hesitation, scurried after him. But as Thorne moved to speak to Adira and Amara, His phone vibrated. A message from his head of security. The license plate on the benefactor's car was registered to a shell corporation, and that corporation shared a director with a legitimate, city-contracted nonprofit youth outreach program. The man who had just left wasn't just a street-level predator. He had a day job inside the very system meant to protect these children. Thorne's victory suddenly felt hollow. He had scared off one snake, but he was now staring into the mouth of the nest. The corruption wasn't on the street corner. It was in the office building, and he had just made himself its #1 target. The nonprofit was called Urban Youth Horizons. Its website featured smiling volunteers, after-school programs, and a mission statement about empowering at-risk youth. Its executive director was a man named Robert Vance, the same man who had just walked out of the community hall, the benefactor. Thorne's team dug overnight. Urban Youth Horizons held several city contracts to provide outreach and diversionary activities for children in underserved neighborhoods. They received state grants and corporate donations, including a $50,000 annual contribution from one of Thorne's own corporate foundations, a fact that made him physically ill. Vance's operation was a masterpiece of cynical duality. The legitimate nonprofit was the front. It provided cover, credibility, and access to grant money. The street exploitation scheme was the black budget. It generated untraceable cash and identified vulnerable families, the very families the nonprofit was supposedly helping. The sick children of the performers became clients for the nonprofit's counseling services, which were never actually rendered. The city was, in effect, paying Vance to find and exploit his own victims. Thorne understood now why his initial foray had failed so completely. He wasn't fighting street thugs. He was fighting a man embedded in the civic machinery, a man who could make phone calls, bury reports, and label inconvenient billionaires as troublesome outsiders. The disappearance of Amara and Adira wasn't just a tactical retreat. It was Vance flexing his institutional muscle, hiding assets within a system Thorne couldn't easily penetrate. He had to move carefully. A direct public accusation against a city-contracted nonprofit without ironclad evidence would backfire spectacularly. He would be painted as a rich dilettante slandering a noble charity. He needed to turn one of Vance's own people. His focus returned to Leo. With Vance's protection suddenly in question, Leo was the most exposed. Thorne's security team found him 3 days later, trying to skip town on a Greyhound bus. They didn't detain him. They simply showed him a folder. Inside were photos of him meeting with Vance, copies of the Shell Corporation documents, and a draft criminal complaint naming Leo as the primary conspirator, while describing Vance as an unwitting beneficiary misled by his subordinate. It was a legal fiction, but a terrifying one for Leo. Faced with the choice of being the fall guy for a powerful man or flipping on him, Leo cracked. He agreed to wear a wire and meet Vance. He would express fear about Thorne's investigation and ask for instructions. The conversation, captured in a parked car outside a diner, was damning. Vance was calm, coldly analytical. He told Leo to let the situation cool, to relocate the primary assets, meaning Amara, and to remind the other handlers of their non-disclosure agreements. He promised the legal exposure would be managed. He never mentioned violence, but he spoke of consequences with the quiet certainty of a man who had made problems disappear before. With the recording in hand, Thorne made his move, but he didn't go to the police. He went to the one city official whose reputation for integrity was unassailable, City Councilwoman Elena Rodriguez, who chaired the committee overseeing social service contracts. He played her the tape. He showed her the financial links between the Shell Corporation and the nonprofit. He laid out the whole sordid model. Rodriguez was horrified but also trapped. If this goes public the way it is, she told him, the city will panic. The contracts will be frozen. A dozen real, vital programs under that nonprofit umbrella will collapse, hurting thousands of innocent kids. And Vance will lawyer up and disappear into the bureaucracy. We'll get him on a minor fraud charge. The system will keep going without him. Thorne argued for a full exposé, a clean sweep. Rodriguez countered with grim political reality. The system was designed to absorb scandal, not to be dismantled by it. She proposed a different, brutal trade. She would use the evidence to force Vance's immediate, quiet resignation for health reasons. She would install new, vetted leadership at Urban Youth Horizons and launch a confidential audit. All the families in the exploitation cell would receive genuine support through new channels. But there would be no press conference, no perp walk. Vance would walk away with a severance package and no criminal record. It was justice neutered. It was the institution protecting itself. Thorne hated it, but he looked at the list of other programs under the nonprofit's umbrella: a food bank, a literacy project, a shelter for homeless teens, and he saw Rodriguez's point. Burning it all down to punish one man would cause collateral damage to the very people he wanted to help. He agreed on one non-negotiable condition: immediate and unconditional safe passage for Amara and Adira, with a legally binding guarantee of their protection and support, overseen by his own lawyers. Rodriguez secured it within hours. Amara and her mother were brought to a new, secure apartment. Adira was admitted to a top-tier hospital. The fear in their eyes when Thorne visited was slowly replaced by a dazed, wary relief. But when he told Amara that the man who had controlled her life would not be going to jail, that the story would be buried to protect other children, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, so his words were the only real thing. The kindness was the lie, and the lie gets to just stop. Her question gutted him. She had articulated the precise failure of the compromise. The corruption wasn't being purged, it was being retired with dignity. The architecture of exploitation remained, only the landlord had changed. This realization sparked Thorne's most dangerous decision yet. If the system was too compromised to deliver justice, he would use its own rules to hollow it out from within. He instructed his legal team to draft paperwork to establish a new nonprofit, but with a radical structure. It would be a direct competitor to Urban Youth Horizons for city contracts. It would be fully transparent, with all finances publicly accessible in real time. And its board would include former clients, people like Adira, once they were well enough. He called it the Sound Trust, named for the one thing they couldn't steal from Amara. Its mission was straightforward: identify children being exploited in informal economies, street performance, begging, minor labor, and provide their families with a direct, no-strings-attached basic income, health care, and legal advocacy, removing the economic desperation that predators fed upon. It was philanthropy as a hostile takeover. When Councilwoman Rodriguez got wind of it, she was furious. She saw it for what it was: a billionaire using his wealth to create a parallel system, undermining the city's authority and making a mockery of her careful compromise. She warned him it was politically explosive, that it would be seen as a private takeover of a public function. Thorne's response was simple: the public function is broken, you admitted it, you're managing the breakage, I'm building a replacement. The Sound Trust's launch was quiet but devastatingly effective. Thorne used his network to recruit social workers disillusioned with the existing bureaucracy. They went straight to the street corners, not with pamphlets but with straightforward contracts. The offer: leave the handler. We will pay you the average of what you earned in the last 3 months, directly, for 6 months, no questions asked. In return, you work with our counselors, your children go to school, and you help us understand the network so we can help others. The first to accept was the boy violinist and his aunt, Mara, then the dancer. Within a month, every child in Leo's former cell was under the protection of the Sound Trust. The street corners they had occupied fell silent. The digital charity pages associated with them were taken down, replaced with a single message: this campaign has concluded. The child is safe and supported. But the silence on those corners was a deafening alarm bell to Robert Vance. His revenue stream had not just been interrupted, it had been systematically dismantled and replaced by a model that exposed his own as the grift it was. His resignation from Urban Youth Horizons had been a strategic retreat. This was an existential threat. Vance struck back not through thugs, but through lawyers and whispers. A series of op-eds appeared in local media, questioning the accountability and long-term viability of billionaire-backed social experiments. Anonymous complaints were filed with city oversight boards, suggesting the Sound Trust was violating child labor laws by contracting with minors. A city audit was launched into the nonprofit's compliance, a process that could freeze its operations for months. Worse, Vance leveraged his remaining connections. Thorne began encountering subtle resistance in his other business ventures, permits delayed, zoning appeals suddenly contested. The message was clear: stay in your lane or we will make your life expensive. The pressure reached its peak when a child protection officer, acting on an anonymous tip, arrived at Amara's new apartment. The tip claimed she was being held in inappropriate seclusion by a wealthy stranger. The officer was polite, but the visit was traumatic for Amara and Adira, reviving all their old fears. Thorne's lawyers got the case dismissed in hours, but the damage was done. The system Vance had inhabited was now being weaponized to harass the victims. Thorne realized he was in a war of attrition against a phantom. Vance was using the bureaucracy as his weapon, hiding behind procedure and anonymity. To win, Thorne needed to make the fight personal for Vance. He needed to attack not his operation, but his legitimacy, the thing Vance had cloaked himself in for so long. The opportunity came from an unexpected data dive. Thorne's forensic accountants, now working full-time on unspooling Vance's finances, discovered a series of payments from the Urban Youth Horizons, professional development budget to a small publishing house. The publishing house had released exactly one book, a self-published memoir by Robert Vance titled The Compassion Circuit, about his 30 years of service to urban youth. The nonprofit had purchased 10,000 copies at $40 a copy to distribute to donors and community partners. Most of those copies were found in a storage unit, still in boxes. It was a blatant, if relatively small, self-dealing scheme to funnel $400,000 of grant money into Vance's pocket. It was the crack in the veneer. It was petty. It was greedy. And it was provable with purchase orders and bank records. This wasn't a complex human trafficking case. It was simple fraud, the kind a district attorney could understand and a newspaper could summarize in a headline. Thorne packaged the evidence and sent it not just to Councilwoman Rodriguez, but to the city's Inspector General, the State Attorney General's Charitable Trusts Division, and two investigative journalists known for their tenacity. He gave them all the same line. The children were his smokescreen. The book was his paycheck. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. The headlines were brutal. Nonprofit CEO bought his own book with grant money. Youth charity spent thousands on director's memoir. The deeper story of exploitation was there in the articles, but the lead was the easily grasped fraud. It was the hook that made the rest of the story believable. The effect was immediate and terminal for Robert Vance. The optics were disastrous. The Inspector General suspended all city payments to Urban Youth Horizons. The board of directors, comprised of local businesspeople who had valued their community standing, voted unanimously to fire Vance and sue him for restitution. His reputation, the asset he'd cultivated for decades, evaporated in a single news cycle. Thorne watched Vance's downfall from a distance. There was no dramatic arrest, but there was a total professional annihilation. Vance became a pariah, unemployable, facing civil lawsuits and possibly criminal charges. It was a cleaner, more complete destruction than any prison sentence could have delivered. In the aftermath, Councilwoman Rodriguez called Thorne. There was no victory in her voice, only exhaustion. You played a dangerous game. You won this round, but you've made powerful enemies. You've shown that the whole edifice is fragile. People who benefit from that fragility won't forget. Thorne knew she was right. He had swapped one kind of war for another. He had gone from hunting a predator to destabilizing an entire ecosystem of complicity. The Sound Trust now stood as a living rebuke to the old way of doing things. It had dozens of children in its care, but it also had a target on its back. He had proven that a single determined outsider could break a corrupt system, but he had also proven how fiercely that system would fight to reassemble itself. He looked at the latest report from the Sound Trust. Amara was enrolled in a music school for the blind. Her first recital was in 2 weeks. Adira was responding to treatment. The silence on those street corners was permanent. It was a victory, yes, but it felt less like an ending and more like a fragile, hard-won beachhead in a much larger, quieter conflict. The real work, protecting that fragile new reality, was just beginning. The recital was held in a small, sunlit auditorium at the School for the Blind. Elias Thorne sat in the third row, watching as Amara, dressed in a simple blue dress, was led to the piano. She placed her hands on the keys, took a quiet breath, and began to play. Not a child's simple melody, but a complex, haunting piece by Mozart. Her face was a mask of concentration. Her head tilted slightly as her fingers found their way across the keys with unerring accuracy. When the final note faded, the silence held for a second before the room erupted in applause. Amara did not smile, but she gave a small, dignified nod. In that moment, she wasn't a victim or a symbol. She was a musician. Afterwards, over juice and cookies, Adira stood beside her daughter, her hand resting on Amara's shoulder. The skeletal frailty was gone, replaced by a steady strength. She was not cured, but she was managed with a care plan and a future. She looked at Thorne and said, "You gave us back our time." That was the real victory. Not riches, not fame, but the simple, profound return of foreseeable tomorrows. The Sound Trust in its first 18 months became a quiet force. It didn't seek headlines. It employed a simple, replicable model: find, fund, and follow up. It had extracted 67 children from various informal exploitative situations, not just street performance, but also forced begging, sham charity sales, and minor labor in family businesses. Each family received a basic income stipend, healthcare access, and legal advocacy. The cost was a fraction of Thorne's wealth, but the impact was geometric. Each child pulled out weakened the economic model of the predators around them. Leo, the former distributor, after a short, failed attempt to start a similar scheme in a neighboring city, was arrested on unrelated fraud charges. He received a 2-year sentence. Robert Vance, stripped of his position and reputation, faced a cascade of civil lawsuits from the city and the nonprofit's board. He declared bankruptcy. The criminal investigation into the self-dealing book scheme was ongoing but moved slowly. He became a ghost, a cautionary tale in nonprofit circles. The systemic rot he represented, however, did not disappear. It simply grew more careful. Councilwoman Elena Rodriguez, true to her word, pushed through stricter oversight measures for city-contracted nonprofits. Audits became more frequent, conflict of interest rules were tightened, but the bureaucratic machinery was vast and resistant. The Sound Trust was viewed with a mix of gratitude and resentment by the old guard, a shining example that made their own inefficiencies look worse. Thorne's other business ventures did face continued, subtle friction from city departments, just as Rodriguez had warned. A real estate development was delayed by a landmark review. A permit for a new research lab required endless additional studies. It was the price of his disruption. He paid it without complaint, but he noted every instance. He was mapping the contours of the institutional pushback. The most significant change, however, was in Thorne himself. The man who had entered a bakery seeking silence found he could no longer tolerate it. The quiet of his estate felt empty, not peaceful. He began spending more time at the Sound Trust's modest offices than in his corporate headquarters. He listened to caseworkers, reviewed family progress reports, and sat in on music lessons. He was no longer a distant benefactor. He was a participant. Amara, now 11, began to speak to him not as a savior but as a person. She asked sharp questions about the trust policies. Why did support stop after 18 months for some families? What happened if a child didn't want to go to school but wanted to work? She wasn't challenging him, she was thinking like a strategist. One afternoon, she told him, "You're giving people fish and teaching some to fish, but you're not draining the swamp where the fishing is so dangerous." The metaphor, coming from a blind child, stunned him with its precision. Her insight led to the Trust's second phase initiative, the Watchtower Project. They began systematically mapping the city for patterns of child exploitation, not to intervene case by case, but to identify geographical and economic pressure points. They shared this anonymized data with legitimate outreach groups and law enforcement, creating heat maps of vulnerability. They started a public awareness campaign, not with tragic images of children, but with simple data visualizations showing how exploitation flowed toward economic desperation. The Trust also established a family guardian program, recruiting and training advocates from within communities that had been exploited. Adira, to Thorne's surprise and deep pride, was among the first to volunteer. She used her experience, her knowledge of the tricks and the pressures, to spot warning signs in other families. Her authority came not from a degree, but from lived survival. 2 years after that cold autumn day on the corner, the city's landscape had subtly shifted. The most brazen child exploitation rings had moved or dissolved, unable to compete with the Trust's alternative. The problem didn't vanish, it mutated, went online, became more hidden. But the most visible, painful symptom on the street corners had been largely alleviated. Then came the final, surprising detail. Thorne was reviewing the Trust's annual financials when his CFO pointed out a recurring, anonymous donation. Every month, like clockwork, a cashier's check for $1,000 arrived at their post office box. It had started 6 months after the Trust's launch. The return address was fake. The handwriting was deliberately blocky and unidentifiable. Thorne's security team, curious, eventually traced the checks. They were purchased at different branches of the same bank, always in cash, by a man who matched Robert Vance's description. They presented the finding to Thorne. Vance, in his ruin, was anonymously funding the very organization that had destroyed him. It wasn't enough money to be significant, but it was a constant, monthly penance. Thorne never acknowledged it. He allowed the checks to be deposited. He understood it not as redemption, but as a message. A broken man, from the ashes of his own corruption, was casting a vote for the world that had replaced his. It was the quietest possible admission of guilt and the strangest form of validation. The story of the blind girl and the billionaire did not end with a fairy tale adoption or a massive charitable foundation splashed across news magazines. It ended with a sustainable, replicable system. It ended with a girl playing Mozart in a sunlit room. It ended with a mother becoming a guardian for others. It ended with a lonely man finding a purpose that filled the silence not with noise, but with meaning. The exploitation economy had met a new equation, one where the cost of compassion was deliberately lowered and the cost of predation was deliberately raised. It wasn't a perfect solution. It was a stubborn, ongoing defense. As Thorne left the school that day, Amara's music still lingering in his mind, he knew the work was perpetual. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't building a company to sell or a fortune to accumulate. He was maintaining a space of safety, note by note, family by family. And in that ongoing effort, he had found something more valuable than any billion-dollar exit, a reason to get up tomorrow. The battle for the street corners was over. The long, quiet war for the soul of the city's compassion was just entering its next, less visible phase. But they had the ground. They had the model. And they had the proof that a single act of seeing someone, truly seeing them, could, with relentless will, change the calculus of an entire hidden world. The music from the auditorium faded, but the resonance of that single, stubborn choice to help would echo far beyond its walls, a quiet testament to the power of focused, intelligent kindness. So what does this story actually tell us? It's not a simple parable about a rich man saving a poor girl. That's the fairy tale, the one we're comfortable with. The real story is about systems. It reveals how exploitation often wears the mask of charity, how desperation is monetized, and how the most vulnerable among us can become commodities in a hidden economy that feeds on our better instincts. Amara's world existed because we, as a society, prefer the quick fix. We drop a coin, feel a pang of sympathy, and walk away believing we've done our part. That transaction is the fuel. It allows the Leos and the Vances to operate in the shadows because our engagement begins and ends with the emotional release of giving, not the hard work of solving. We fund the symptom and call it compassion, never asking why the disease persists. But this story also shows the antidote. It wasn't Elias Thorne's money that fixed things, it was his attention, his stubborn refusal to accept the surface narrative. He moved from pity to scrutiny, from charity to justice. He asked the questions everyone else avoided. Where does the money go? Who benefits from this child's suffering? What are the real numbers? That shift from feeling to forensic thinking is what dismantled the machine. The lingering question for all of us is this: how many other Amaras are performing right now, not just on street corners, but in the vast, unregulated theater of online virality? How many tragedies are being packaged, streamlined, and sold back to us as content, with the real beneficiaries hidden behind GoFundMe pages and emotional hashtags? Our clicks, our shares, our donations, are they alleviating suffering, or are they just feeding a more sophisticated version of the same old tin cup? The call isn't to stop caring, it's to care smarter, to look past the single, heartbreaking image and ask about the architecture around it, to support solutions that build autonomy, not dependency, to value transparency over tear-jerking narratives. Real change isn't photogenic. It's slow, it's bureaucratic, it's about data and contracts and stubborn follow-through. It's the unglamorous work of draining the swamp. Amara's song was a siren call, not just for one man, but for all of us to wake up, to understand that every act of kindness exists within a marketplace. We can choose to be thoughtful investors in human dignity, or we can remain impulsive consumers of our own guilt. The power to redesign that marketplace, to make exploitation unprofitable and compassion sustainable, doesn't lie in a billionaire's bank account. It lies in our collective willingness to see deeply, think critically, and demand more from the stories we're told. If this story made you look at the world a little differently, if it challenged the simple narrative of rescue, then share it. Start a conversation. Ask the harder questions. And if you want to join us in exploring more complex, real-world stories that dig beneath the surface, stories that empower rather than just entertain, then subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a deep dive into the forces that shape our humanity. We leave you with this final thought. The most revolutionary act is often not a grand gesture, but a simple, sustained decision. To see the person, not just the performance. To listen for the whole song, not just the catchy hook. In that space of true attention, miracles don't just happen, they get built to last. Thank you for watching.